Hello, my name is Oliver Ressler. I'm an artist and filmmaker, and I curated the exhibition Overground Resistance, in which this public event is taking place. And today I'm very happy to introduce you to Arts for the Commons. It's a collective platform consisting of primarily Rosa Jijon from Ecuador, an Ecuadorian visual artist, and Francesco Martone, who is an Italian activist. And they started working on migration and borders with exhibitions in Ecuador, Italy, and Slovenia, and a publication on migration and contemporary arts. Arts for the Commons not only operates as a platform, but attempts to create a new commons, a synthesis between arts and political engagement. So Rosa is an artist, activist, and cultural mediator. She's the former director of the Centro de Arte Contemporáneo de Quito. She has participated in several exhibitions, including in the Venice Biennale and Biennale de Havana. And she participated in artistic residences. She deals with human mobility and migration, citizenship, social justice, and environment, and has engaged in participatory art production with grassroots organizations and communities, from migrant women to Roma communities, indigenous peoples, and street gangs. And she also served more recently as cultural secretary of the Italian Latin American Association in Rome. And Francesco is an associate of the Transnational Institute. He has been engaged on issues relating to forests, climate change, rights of nature, indigenous people's rights, defenders of the environment, and environmental justice since 1988. He's a founding member of Greenpeace Italy, a juror and member of the Permanent People's Tribunal and the International Tribunal on the Rights of Nature, and a policy advisor for international NGOs on the rights of indigenous peoples. More recently, he collaborated with Forest Peoples Program on the creation of a Zero Tolerance Initiative, an international network of NGOs and indigenous peoples organizations working in support of environmental defenders threatened by extractive and agribusiness sectors. So please give a warm welcome to Arts for the Commons.
Hello.
Zuerst möchte ich Oliver und Elisabeth danken für die Einladung an diese Künstlerresidenz. Das hat uns die Möglichkeit gegeben, unsere Arbeit wieder weiterzuentwickeln und auch von dieser Ausstellung andere Künstlerwerke zu beobachten und unsere Kenntnis der Beziehung zwischen Künstleraktivität und Aktivismus zu vertiefen. So, das war wirklich für uns eine sehr wichtige Möglichkeit, auch um unsere Arbeit mit Ihnen zu erklären und darüber reden. Dann möchte ich auf Englisch sprechen, aber vielen Dank. I'm not proposing a return to the Stone Age. My intent is not reactionary, not even conservative, but simply subversive. It seems that the utopian imagination is trapped like capitalism and industrialism, and the human population in a one-way future consisting only of growth. All I'm trying to do is to figure out how to put a pig on the tracks. This is anarchist and feminist writer Ursula Le Guin that is very much inspiration for us. And what we're trying to do, actually, we're trying, as many others, to release utopian imagination. And what the story we want to start our presentation with is the story of how two frogs managed to put a pig on the right track.
Well, thank you very much for your presence, and thank you, Oliver, for inviting us, and thank you, Elizabeth, for all your support and for inviting us to this residency. I don't think I need to be using this one, but that one? Anyway, it's okay. I can use this one. Thank you for having us here in this amazing place, and also in this amazing opportunity regarding the exhibition Overground Resistance, because that gives a lot of meaning to all the work that we've been doing as artists and activists. The tale of two frogs and a mine comes from Ecuador. In Cotacachi, Ecuador, which is a small place in the northern part of the capital, on September 24th, 2020, a local court ruling prohibits the Ullurimanga copper and molybdenum mining concession on grounds that it would have endangered cloud forest ecosystems and its biodiversity. Some of the species that were going to be endangered by these mining projects were these two frogs, the Lognos harlequin frog and the confusing rocket frog that you can see on this picture. The court ruling accepted the claim presented by local and national organizations on grounds that the Ecuadorian government had failed to carry out proper environmental impact assessments that would violate the rights of nature and that are enshrined in the Ecuadorian constitution. So actually it was not nature, it was not the communities, it was not the forest, it was the frogs that won with this verdict the case in front of the court of law. In application of the precautionary principle, in application also of the reasonableness criteria and of the danger and threat of extinction to which the animal and plant species have been exposed, as well as the physical components of Ullurimanga mining concession, as they are not even included in the environmental impact studies, establishing the verisimilitude of factual antecedents of affectation to the physical component of nature by the activities carried out by a company under the control and evaluation of the Ministry of Environment and Water, and that today the extinction of a species, animals, or plant is irreversible. As precautionary measures, the suspension of the administrative process of approval of the complementary study to the ex-ante environmental impact study and environmental managed plan, advanced exploration phase of the metallic minerals of the Ullurimanga mineral area in 2018. And so as we can see, the news and the local papers and international papers were that these two frogs actually won a legal case against the government and against the mining companies.
This case summarizes some of the topics we are currently working on, notably the issue, as Oliver was saying, rights of nature as a tool to support struggle for the protection of ecosystems and the communities that live in those ecosystems, and confronting extractivism, and also critically intervening in the debate on the issues like Anthropocene and Capitalocene. As Oliver was saying, we started working mostly on urban areas, and initially our purpose was to unveil the hidden story behind some urban spaces, in particular in Rome. This piece of art this video is taken from a video, A Room with a View, that is also included in the publication Dreamland, that is also hosting Oliver and Zanni Beg work, The Rite of Passage. And in this case, what we wanted to do, this location has a particular story. This was a building that had been occupied by Eritrean refugees nearby the Italian Rome railway station. And there was a theater of a ruthless eviction by the Italian police, like I think it was three or four summers ago, in the middle of August, where these people had been dislodged brutally and also with water hoses were dispersed. And this story and the pictures really made the headlines because they were kind of evocative of the colonial past of Italy. Eritrea and Ethiopia were former colonies, and these people are refugees that were escaping a dictatorship. But the interesting thing, the thing that we wanted to highlight was that place was not a place occupied by criminals, but it was a place where these communities were building communities. They were creating different worlds. They were trying to organize self-government and mutual support. Basically, they were trying to create a mobile commons. And so we thought this was also very evocative and telling about how this new wave of financial extractivism is actually also spilling over urban areas. This building now is going to be the location where financial companies' offices will be located, and also an important transnational company gym. So this is this connection also between how the urban commons can be created by migrant communities, but also how these commons can be disarticulated by the pressure of financial speculation. But how did we decide to move from migrant issues into environmental justice and extractivism? There was a book by Martinican philosopher Malcolm Ferdinand about decolonizing ecology from a Caribbean viewpoint, that for us has been very, very illuminating and very important, because it was making a very important connection between the current environmental discussion, debate, and environmental struggles, and the history of slavery and of colonialism. Usually we are used to think about colonialism only in terms of the conquest of the Americas 500 years ago, but local struggles, environmental struggles in Latin America are not only characterized by the participation and engagement of indigenous peoples, but also Afro-descendant communities that are basically those that tell us a different story, a story of slavery, and a story of a further level of colonization. It's interesting because Malcolm Ferdinand is quoting Alice Walker in his book, saying, some of us are used to think that woman is a Negro of the world, that the colored people is a Negro of the world, that the poor people are the Negro of the world. But actually it is the Mother Earth that is become the Negro of the world. And you can see it also, interestingly enough, I think either himself or there's another very important publication about black geology by Karen Youssef, titled 1 Billion Anthropocenes or None. And they also tell the story about traditional dances. These are descendants of the slaves smuggled from Africa. And this dance in Grenada, Jab Jab Carnival, is a very interesting one, because you see these people, they're black people, descendants of the slaves, they engage in a ritual of liberation and of freedom, and this is the other untold story about slavery, and they're covered with oil. So you can always see here, visually, the juxtaposition, the overlapping between two different concepts of calories and of fuel, the human fuel of the muscles of the slaves that was used to expand plantations in the particular phase of capitalism and extractivism, and the fossil fuel that was then the next generation of development of extraction. So basically the argument is that those two things are very strongly connected. And if you go into Latin America, the intersection between colonialidad del poder, as Peruvian theorist Aníbal Quijano used to describe the entrenched institutional racism versus indigenous peoples and Afro-descendant communities is a very strong challenge connected to the need to confront patriarchy, to the need to confront extractivism, and on the other hand, to propose and counter-propose different concepts. There is a very interesting concept that is called pluriverse. There is not only one universe composed of a market system that thinks about nature as a product or as an object to exploit, but as something that is more composite, that belongs to community, to the humanity as such, but also that has rights on its own. And this is derived mostly from indigenous cosmologies and indigenous traditional knowledge systems that are still very much in place and that contribute now, paradoxically, to be some of the most effective solutions to biodiversity and climate change crisis. So the connection between concepts like good living, buen vivir, rights of nature, Pachamama, the Mother Earth, and the struggles against extractivism, against patriarchy is very, very evident, not only in theory, but also in practice of communities and movements in Latin America. So basically what we're trying to do, we're trying to think about our work as a contribution to the debate, but also to the activist and artist world, on those people that are engaged in this attempt to decolonize environmental struggles and decolonize also the way of looking at those things and looking at the global environmental crisis and try to tell the stories that are behind the places, the ecosystems, that are not necessarily ecosystems that are doomed for destruction or as sacrifice zones, that can also be spaces of resistance and articulation of alternatives, like those areas where, those spaces where, rights are recognized or people are resisting against the advance of the extractive capitalism. So we think that this way, by doing this, we can open up a new concept of geography and space. And this work also is part of this, let's say, process of investigation. This work is called Have a Wonderful Time, and it's been developing through probably 4 years, and it's very much connected to the work I was doing in the past. I was a political advisor of indigenous peoples organizations, and we went 4 or 5 times in the new model city in the outskirts of Seoul called Songdo, that also the headquarters of the Green Climate Fund, that is a financial institution that finances climate change programs agreed in the Paris conference. That was also where all these barricades were built. And so being there, we could really physically realize how this new phase of extraction of value is actually altering ecosystems. This city has been built on a landfill, like few square kilometers landfill on the ocean, and in order to build it, ecosystems had to be displaced and rare species of animals as well. But paradoxically, like the Platalea minor, that was also replaced by this wooden sculpture. So that city is actually the clear evidence of how these new extraterritorial spaces, in fact, it is part of an economic free trade zone, actually are altering ecosystems, but they're also altering the concept of time. In fact, interestingly enough, the only things that can be considered as acts of dissent or subversion in these kind of prefabricated environments, like this smart city that was built from scratch on a plan by architectural company in the Netherlands, is to practice normal things, like these old women picking up herbs in this garden, or children playing football, or other people playing the murga in the middle of skyscrapers. And these seem to be, like, in memory of Guy Debord, the only ways of using the derive or normal acts of daily life as a subversive acts against this kind of prefabricated environment.
At a certain point, the then president of Ecuador had made a trip to go and see what were the opportunities for Ecuador, and he went on a big tour in Asia, and he went to Songdo, and he found out that that could be a great idea to bring to Ecuador, a non-industrial country like mine, the idea of an intelligent city and of the city of knowledge. And so he founded this thing in the middle of the Andes, in a sacred zone of a community called the Otavalos, and he founded this thing called Yachay, which is knowledge in Quechua language. And also there was a lot of extractivism, knowledge extractivism, epistemological extractivism, and then they planted that in the middle of, this place where there's a lot of medicinal plants, and that was not an innocent choice, because the idea was also to bring in some pharmaceuticals and some researchers from big universities from the north of the world and do some research on how to extract, the principles of these plants and bring them to the world. So that was Yachay, and funny enough, both projects are failed projects. Ecuador's super university is being crushed. No students were there. No teachers wanted to go there. It was too expensive. It was too difficult. Just recently, I think that the dean of the university was called to the Congress, and he said, well, the thing is not that we spent too much money and that we devastated the territory. The thing is that the country is not ready for knowledge. So that was, how he justified the failure of this project. The same thing with Korea, with Songdo. They built this beautiful, amazing city, but there's no neighbors. Nobody's going there. Nobody is talking to each other. So the example city and the daughter city are examples of total failure.
So as you can see, from the case of Songdo and Yachay, we look at different clash between different concepts of the environment and ecology. Songdo considered to be the green city, model city for the world, that in fact is supposed to be a zero carbon emission city, but to the expense of very fragile ecosystems, and that is now actually also unlivable because of the air pollution imported from China, from Seoul. And Yachay, that was supposed to be the city of knowledge, but in fact it was a city or an instrument or infrastructure determined to extract traditional knowledge and turn it into a commodity for the market.
And that brings us to the latest project that we are working on. In the latest months, we've been working on a project that you can see here. It's called Vilcabamba, the Iura fluminis et Terra. Vilcabamba is the name of a kingdom in the Tahuantinsuyo, in the Inca Empire. And it also gave the name to a river in Ecuador, in the southern part of Ecuador. This river is a very small river, but whose rights were recognized in 2014. There is the Biennale of Sydney on next year. It's going to be in March in 2022. And it has been curated, or is being curated by Jose Roca, which is a Colombian curator who has been working a lot with water issues. And he decided to call this Biennale Rivus, which comes from a Latin word that means river, but also rivals. And Rivus will enable aqueous beings, as they say, rivers, wetlands, and other salt and freshwater ecosystem to share a dialogue with artists, architects, designers, scientists, and communities. Considering the water ecologist perspective raises unlikely questions. Can a river sue over psychoactive sewage? Will oysters grow teeth in aquatic revenge? What does the eels think? Are waves the ocean's desire? Those are like the kind of questions that he is asking. And so we decided to ask a different question, or an absurd question as the one that the curator is asking, trying to rethink geography and the voices of the rivers from a different perspective. So we decided how do we bring those rivers? How do we bring the voices of rivers from Vilcabamba, from the southern part of Ecuador? And how do we bring the fact that rivers have been recognized their rights in so many parts of the world to a biennale in Australia that we might not be able to even go there because, you know, the borders are still closed. So we decided, let's take the identity of these rivers. How do we take the identity? You know, we all have identity cards and we have a number on identity cards. So we decided, why don't we try to grab some hard data from these rivers, like GPS coordinates, and try to transform these coordinates into sound registers. And then from those sound registers, how do we get a set of notes? And then from those notes, how do we get music? So this is a total arbitrary speculation that we're doing as artists, not knowing anything about sound art or music or composition. But fortunately and luckily enough, we found people who accepted the challenge. And so we started working with scientists and mathematicians looking for these GPS coordinates. And GPS coordinates from our side of the view are instruments that have been used, have been invented by northern countries of the world. Parallels and meridians were not decided in all parts of the planet. They were decided either in Washington or in England, or the French commission that came to Ecuador and gave us the name Ecuador decided that this is the meter and this is how we're going to measure the planet, without even asking us if we agree upon that. So GPS is an instrument that has been used to measure the world, but also to go and find where to extract minerals and all kinds of resources, how to find out where activists are or communities are resistant, how to expand territories of extraction, all sorts of colonialism strategies. But there have been also been used by indigenous peoples or communities to map their places. So this GPS is not only an identity number for those rivers, but is a way also of challenging geography, to doing an operation of critical geography in a way. So this is what we're doing. We're bringing the voices of rivers. We cannot let you listen to the music yet because the people from the Biennale are going to kill us if we do that. This is like being in Cannes and talking about the film and telling you have to go and see the film, you have to, but I won't tell you who the killer is. And so we have found this is a map that we have been given by an organization called Rivers International that can be consulted. This is like an alternative map where you see all the dots of all the rivers that have been recognized as juridical person, they have legal personhood. The red dots are those that are being, in process of having their rights recognized. The yellow ones is big challenging, and the process is still on the way, and so on and so forth. So luckily enough, and fortunately enough, this idea is spreading around the world, and it's coming, very, very strongly. I just wanted to show you the score that the musician finally made out of all this speculation. So we actually have a music right now. It's a 3-movement and 2-movement and intermezzo music that is going to be on display in this Biennale. So we managed to transform this hard data into music.
And then the idea is to, since this exercise is not only an artistic exercise, but also a political one. We've been establishing a kind of transnational commons, because the work that is being done in different parts of the world. There is an Australian hub composed of aboriginal activists and artists and academics working on the rights of rivers, and there is an Italian hub that is mostly the logistic one that is taking care also of the organization of the landing page. There is an Ecuadorian hub. Some of the partners are in the project are the Global Alliance on the Rights of Nature, International Rivers, that is based in California, the Tribunal of the Rights of Nature, another organization that work on water justice or hydro justice, and Iniciativa de Cuencas Sagradas, that's a binational initiative of indigenous peoples of the Peruvian and Ecuadorian Amazon that are proposing a different way of managing the watersheds and are considered sacred for indigenous peoples. So it's interestingly enough, as Rosa was saying, GPS coordinates have been decolonized and used in a decolonial manner by indigenous peoples, in particular the Waorani in Ecuador. And it's very interesting because if you look at the way the Waorani have been mapping their land, they have been trying to tell the stories behind the spaces. The Waorani map, if you can show it, is composed of different locations that have been identified both through GPS and through ground truthing and through discussion with the elders. There are areas of common use, sacred areas, areas where there are species that are considered as untouchable, common areas like water. So they tell us of a geography that is completely different. So the GPS can be used also to tell a geography that is completely different. And for the Waorani, demarcating this land has been also a weapon of struggle, because only by demarcating their land they knew where they could exert their rights of self-determination, free prior informed consent, the right of resistance, and the right to protect nature as a legal entity, as recognized by the Ecuadorian constitution. And in fact, they also won a very historical case a year and a half ago. They managed to stop the expansion of oil schemes in their land. While we were in Ecuador thinking and working this project together with academics that work on the rights of nature and movements, we also decided to get engaged in some of the local struggles against extractivism, like this struggle, that is a struggle of communities of the Quito urban area against the expansion of gold mining in very, very fragile and unique ecosystems of the Chocó Andino. And this is their story.
So to begin with, Quito is a city of, like any city in Latin America, with a lot of peripheries and outskirts. But the interesting part of Quito, which is 2,850 meters high, it has like 16 or 20, I can't remember very well, municipalities that are rural municipalities. One of them is the Chocó Andino, which is a cloud forest with one of the biggest biodiversities in the world, because we have this strange thing that we have cloud forest, tropical, almost tropical forest, but above 1,500 meters high, which is very strange. So that's why we have so much of this biodiversity. And there is a project of course, there's a lot of biodiversity, but also a lot of minerals there. So people in Ecuador were trying, or in Quito, were trying to bring to the Constitutional Court a plea to stop mining there. And this is like a small video that we made.
So when we were in Ecuador, we decided also to pay a visit to this community that has been staying in that place for almost 160 days to stop the mining expansion and to denounce the violations of Ecuadorian laws on environmental impact assessment studies.
And unluckily, they presented this thing to the Constitutional Court, but they rejected. It was rejected.
But interestingly enough, the very same day where we went to visit that community, in Rome, something similar was happening. There is a very interesting story that is not very well known probably, but tells about the issue of how nature can also exert its own agency. And this is a story of a lake. The Lago Bullicante is the only urban lake in Rome that basically came out spontaneously from an area that was a dismissed area, an industrial area in the outskirts of Rome. There was an old chemical plant factory. It's called Lago Bullicante. And since then, it has become the symbol of resistance against capitalism and for the protection of Mother Earth, for the community living there, for the children, for the families of this neighborhood called Torpignattara. Torpignattara is in the outskirts and is a multicultural neighborhood where racists are banned, where people live together, they create this kind of commoning. And interestingly enough, the lake itself is also now the home of very, very rare species. So basically in the last 2 or 3 years, biodiversity came back. It was a rewilding process of an urban outskirt. And the custodians of this lake are migrants that have created a cooperative, and they are basically managing and protecting the lake. The lake is under threat because a construction company wants to expand and wants to fell the trees and wants to build. So those days, all the neighborhood and all the citizens were in fact chaining themselves against the bulldozers to stop the destruction of the lake itself. And then we were talking to them and say, well, what can we do for you? And we decided to offer them the possibility of connecting with the international movement for the rights of nature, and we went there to do a performance. So we went to the Lago Bullicante that you can see from the back, and we read the Declaration of the Bill of Rights of the Lake Ohio, where the citizens of Toledo in the United States asked for the recognition of the rights of the lake not to be contaminated, but actually to continue to live freely and without human interference. So this is a part of the performance.
Lake Erie and the Lake Erie watershed possess the right to exist, flourish, and naturally evolve. The Lake Erie ecosystem shall include all natural water features, communities of organisms, soils, as well as terrestrial and aquatic sub-ecosystems that are part of the Lake Erie and its watershed.
B. Right to a clean and healthy environment. The people of the city of Toledo possess the right to a clean and healthy environment, which shall include the right to a clean and healthy Lake Erie and Lake Erie ecosystem.
C. Right of local community self-government. The people of the city of Toledo possess both a collective and individual right to self-government in their local community, a right to a system of government that embodies that right, and the right to a system of government that protects and secures their human, civil, and collective rights.
D. Rights as self-executing. All rights secured by this law are inherent, fundamental, and unalienable, and shall be self-executing and enforceable against both private and public actors. Further, implementing legislation shall not be required for the city of Toledo, the residents of the city, or the ecosystems as natural communities protected by this law to enforce all the provisions of this law.
But one of the activities that we carried out during this residence has been a class in the Rome University on the course of environmental humanities. And in the class, it was us, there were representatives of the city of Toledo. There was an academic that is part of the Global Alliance on the Rights of Nature, and the class was held inside the community location space of the movement that is protecting the lake. So we basically shared ideas on how to build up the struggle and how to work together for the recognition of the rights of this lake, Bullicante.
And why is it, before we close, why is it that we are so obsessed with the rights of nature? Well, I believe that the rights of nature is not something that was invented in Ecuador, in Latin America, but surely after we decided to put it into the Constitution on 2008 and recognize the rights of nature, and then in Cochabamba in 2010 it was recognized in a Bolivian constitution, and from then on there has been, you know, a very important movement for recognizing the rights of nature. And this concept of recognizing the non-human with the right to get a better life, to justice, and to be defended is not something that came out of the blue from a juridical point of view, but it is the result of the thought, of the meaning, of the way of thinking, of the cosmovision of indigenous peoples from Latin America, but also indigenous peoples from Asia, indigenous peoples or the peoples from the global north. I'm thinking about, you know, the people in Sweden, or the indigenous peoples also in Finland. So that way of thinking, of conceiving the planet and the earth, not as us humans who are supposed to govern on the other living, but we as part of this whole living. I think that's the interesting part of going back and forth also from one place to the other, as we do from Ecuador and from Italy, and, you know, travel upon these cosmovisions and of these ways of looking at nature.
Thanks a lot for this very interesting and comprehensive presentation, including so many different aspects of your work. I think that's great to see, also the variety of different aspects. I mean, Ecuador was the first country in the world to include the rights of nature in the constitution. Yeah. There were also great initiatives from the time when Korea was still their president to propose the international community not to destroy a rainforest in order to get rid of the commodities, the raw materials below. Unfortunately, this offer was rejected by the international community that was asked to pay a share of the expected profits. Maybe tell us a bit about why such things happen in Ecuador. What do you think? Let us know a bit about the context.
I do believe that Ecuador has a very particular way of being. On a certain, this comes a little bit from the history of the country. While there were these big dictatorships in South America, Ecuador never had like a hard dictatorship, but a soft one. There were not people persecuted or incarcerated or killed or anything like that. It was the military that was not such a long period of time, and they were in a way just appropriating of land, but they were not persecuting people. And that gave like a state of peace in Ecuador. And when we became a democratic republic, some time has passed. It was in '79, and then at a certain point there was a lot of upbringings from the indigenous peoples. And Ecuador is a very strange country. It has 200 and something years of republican life and more than 22 constitutions. So we change constitutions as we change t-shirts. You know, every time something comes out, no, we have to make up another, so we have to come up with another constitution. So finally, by year 98, that was the first time that indigenous communities and indigenous territories in a multicultural country was recognized. So that's what it all comes from. And so we have a very healthy indigenous movement in Ecuador that has the power to put pressure on governments. And that's the result of what Correa, in his first mandate, this president, listened to and came up with this constitution. So I think I'm not telling that we don't have a lot of inequalities, but I think that the history of our country has been such that, especially indigenous communities and the intercultural project of the country has been a possibility. In the same years, when 98 was the year of recognizing multicultural state, that was the same year when people were being slaughtered and killed in Guatemala, indigenous peoples. So if you see, the difference, we have a very active, civil society pushing, and that's thanks to our history, I think.
Yes, and in fact, the process of the elaboration of the current constitution is also a very important one, because it's been really a process from below. So the constitution has very kind of innovative aspects, as we said, the rights of nature, el buen vivir, the right to resistance. Many of these communities that then will be judicially prosecuted will be acquitted because they actually invoke the constitutional right to resistance. And also, one of the key elements of the initial period of Correa presidency was the transformation of the productive matrix. So initially the idea was really to move away from oil, but the extreme dependence of oil exports for currency, for import of hard currency to fund social projects and poverty alleviation infrastructures, then created a situation where a drop in the price of commodities also increased the pressure on those commodities to gain more money. And this is when the conflict came up. And this is going to be an ongoing conflict because the current president just announced that he wants to double the production of oil. And this is going to be really when this kind of honeymoon period with this presidency will end. And we expect really much conflict to generate, especially in the Ecuadorian Amazon.
Yeah, I'm also interested in this bringing voices to the rivers, which was the title of one of your slides, and this to attribute legal personhood to a river. I mean, it reminds me a bit towards the debate that existed like probably 20 years ago or more, when there were attempts primarily from the right, I think in the US, to attribute personhood to corporations. And so this appears a bit like an oppositional movement from the more progressive and left activists to introduce something that also appears a bit strange. As, I mean, of course, it's quite complicated, for example, to sue a river or whatever, or if it floods maybe a town or yeah, maybe talk a bit more about this strategy and this context of how this developed.
This developed after a book was published in the US that was talking about whether trees would have rights or not. And in fact, legal personhood is just one of the strategies, and there is no fixed matrix in the sense that in other cases, like for instance in the first case in New Zealand, in the Wanganui River, that is actually not a real legal personhood, but is an ancestral right recognized to the Maoris. And this is part of the colonial heritage of the Waitangi Treaty. That was a treaty that the British Empire imposed to the Maoris to control their territories. So it depends. The strategy is very much connected to the capacity of communities to consider themselves as guardian of the ecosystems, and then how they consider that ecosystem and what would be the best tool. In fact, you're right, there is an issue about reciprocity, but in a way, in many cases it is not possible for an ecosystem to go to courts. So the guardians or the custodians, that are the communities that have been protecting the ecosystem, can actually go to court on behalf of the ecosystems. But this is, in fact, a very interesting process, because on the one hand, you have an expansion of this strategy. For instance, the latest case is in Europe, is the Tavignano River in Corsica, but also it's an ongoing process. And in fact, the interesting fact is that this International Tribunal on the Rights of Nature, today there is a conference called to organize the session for the COP in Glasgow, is a space where this jurisprudence is being currently further developed on the basis not only of academic research, but on the cases of inputs from the communities in resistance. So there is this very kind of interesting feedback loop between struggles from below, the cosmovisions on the one hand, and also the need to push the bar in the international legal system to go beyond the human focus.
In fact, these people in Australia, I don't know if it's together with the Matawara Fitzroy River, it is, I think, coalition. They are at this moment trying to come up with something even further, which is the ancestral rights of rivers. And of course we're talking about rights and we're talking about a legal infrastructure, if you want. But the interesting part of this is that it's never done by one side or one person. It's also always the result of a community effort of activists and indigenous peoples and organizations. It's a collaborative effort to start going and writing these pleas for the recognizing the legal personhood of these rivers and making sure that there are some custodians that can guarantee that. And it's usually, for example, in the Martuwarra Fitzroy River, which is not over yet, it's the aboriginous peoples, and there's a big intention to go in with mining also in this river. So they do use it also as an instrument of resistance.
And as you, and you rightly pointed out, the issue is not only legal personhood, but the intrinsic rights of these ecosystems to continue to exist, to thrive, and to reproduce. So this is, legal personhood is a strategy, the other one is to recognize these rights.
Also in your artistic practice, you try to involve lots of different organizations, like in the project for the Sydney Biennale. I just want to quickly read the list of collaborators: Global Alliance on the Rights of Nature, the International Tribunal on the Rights of Nature, a collective of Australian Aboriginal artists and academics. So how do you organize or how do you structure such collaborations? And
well, we are part, in some cases we are part of this organization.
That's why we don't try to call ourselves like an artistic collective. Because I don't think that ArtsForTheCommons is actually a collective. I think it's a platform. That's why we want to. And the platform means that you can host anybody. And that depends. We like to be very nomadic, unstable, permeable. And so every time we come up with a project or with something, people can get in and out and, make this malleable thing that I would take the liquid identity of this sort of collective platform or experiment, let's call it like that. So when we find a subject and we start working with it, we usually, it's the result of some conversations that happened before, and so people it's like when you do any engagement with resistance or any activism, you have already people that are aware of that they're interested in, that they're passionate about things. So, and it's never the same thing. It's not fixed. Coming from a place and going to the other and living in some other place, that gives you, even with COVID restrictions, it gives you a very nomadic way of thinking, and I think that is the result of this. So it's like A4C is not what it is or when it is. It depends on when and where. And pretty much that's an answer that I can give.
Yeah. No, but also, in many cases, we are also part of those organizations. Like I am a member of the International Tribunal on the Rights of Nature and of the Global Alliance. So we have been discussing this together before actually coming to this level of definition of the project. The publication, Dreamland, was not only a response to a publication by Italian philosopher Sandro Mezzadra on the border as a method, but it was also conceived while the People's Tribunal was developing, together with migrant movements in Europe and globally, a series of sessions on the rights of migrants and the genocide of migrants in the Mediterranean. And it was also meant to be a kind of, let's say, visual contribution to the works of the tribunal. So we always try to interpret our role as artists and activists, being creating bridges and moving from one space to the other. And this movement from one space to the other is actually where the interstitial space where we want to operate.
But would you say these groups function more like an advisory board, or do they take over certain tasks in the collaborative process?
They do. Well, are they just providing advice, or they actually participate in the process?
Oh, most of the time they do participate in the process. They are very active. Also in, I don't know, being like a platform also for the project, but also with contributing with, like in the case of the rivers map. And they were working on it, and then they accelerated their work, and to be able to present it. So I think it's also like an enabler in a way. When we talk about migrations, for example, I've been living in Italy for the last 20 years, and I've been very active with the migrant movement there. First with women migrants, and then I was part of the biggest campaign that has ever been made, and I hope it's sometime going to be accepted, on the Ius Solis campaign, the campaign to give the citizenship to the children of immigrants in Italy. So, but I was part of that movement. So it's coming in and out. It's not only their consultancy, but it's actually us being part of those movements.
Yeah, and for instance, the event of Sunday, when we will present online, our project of the Biennale, will also be, it's going to be taking place during the World Rivers Day. And during that event, we will be relaunching an international call for action to support the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Rivers, that is also being the product of the advocacy efforts and work of international rivers. So international rivers then will pick it up again. So it's a kind of mutual support in the work we all do.
Are there any questions from the audience?
I'm still trying to wrap my head around the concept of a river as a legal person, especially how it would actually work in the case of an international divide. I think there are already rivers who are recognized as a legal person.
Yes.
Are those international?
No, they're national.
Who is then deciding for the river? Because if it's the indigenous people, how do they find consensus? How do they even communicate along the river? For me, it poses a lot of practical difficulties. So with, I think it's a nice concept that the river can sue whoever is sabotaging it, so to speak. But legal procedures usually take a lot of money. So if we have if the legal person is indigenous people, they usually wouldn't have a lot of money, right?
He will. Yeah. Well, first of all, it's on a national. It's on a national ground. There's still not such a court, international court, to receive the claims for the legal personhood of rivers. It depends always on each country. And that's for the moment. But if you get the chance to see later also this map, you will see what not indigenous peoples are behind these pleas and these processes, but also a lot of organizations. So it can give you a clearer, more practical idea of how exactly it is going to work.
Yeah, but also, I mean, in many cases, this is not only legal personhood, as I said. There are court rulings, or there are local municipality or local authorities regulations that establish that those rivers are intangible because they are their own rights. And so that means that there will be public action to protect the rivers. So there is not only a theoretical admission of these rights, but these are then subsequently enshrined in administrative commitments and political commitments. So there are regulations that then would be used to respect and ensure those rivers' rights. And obviously this can be then appealed to in case of violation by any citizen. For instance, in the case of Vilcabamba, it were two American citizens that decided to appeal to the local court on the basis of the Ecuadorian constitution, because the river was the part of the river where they were living was being destroyed by the construction of a road. And the local court admitted that claim and basically protected the old Vilcabamba River for any further exploitation.
I think there might be a possibility of pro bono work by people who defend the river in court.
So
Yes,
so
It's not only a question of money, it's a question of commitment.
Yes.
It goes hand in hand with like Naturschutzgesetze or something like that.
Excuse me?
With
Natural conservation laws.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which then can be.
But yes, I think that all these resistant movements and all the movements that, there's a big part of work in all these issues that is pro bono, generally speaking. But not only. And that's the interesting part when you have like such a big thing like the Tribunal of the Rights of Nature, which is also in a way pro bono because of course judges are not being paid to be judges in the tribunal. It's an opinion tribunal. But the cases, when you build them, it's the result of the work of a lot of research and activism and picking up data and documentation and everything. And that usually is being financed. So when you get to the court, to the Tribunal of the Rights of Nature, you actually get with the scientific information and very interesting and very concise information that can make it possible to have a verdict. So, these are all instruments in the making, but they're very, very well organized.
Yeah, for instance, very quickly, I can give you I was part of a tribunal on fracking in Alaska. And the recurrent were indigenous groups, there were normal citizens, there were lawyers and academics that were asking the Permanent People Tribunal to basically dictate a ruling that then would be used by them as an instrument for further advocacy at the legal and political level. That was an interesting case because in that case we were asked to discuss how human rights relate to the rights of nature. And it's a kind of very challenging legal argument. And basically we concluded that the violations of the rights of nature implicitly also mean violations of human rights to an healthy environment, for instance, or to health. So there is a connection in terms of the co-violations of these rights. And in fact, this is now a new jurisprudence that is developing that is actually bringing together earth jurisprudence and the traditional human rights laws and international law, saying, okay, if you violate the right of a community to a healthy environment, that brings with it the violation of the rights of nature and vice versa. So the two things go hand in hand.
I'd like to mention a country where the ecology is heavily endangered, but some years ago, about maybe 15 years ago, due to pressure from the population, National Green Tribunal was established, which is, if you look at the history, it's amazing. They have stopped a lot of bad projects, they have encouraged a lot of good stuff, and this is India. And in India, there is a lot of respect for the courts. So that is very effective. take a look at the National Green Tribunal in India.
Yeah, and incidentally, one of the main big battles that was probably the first great big transnational campaign against big dams was in India, the Narmada. And there are some rivers in India that have also legal personhood, like the Yamuna, the Ganges and the Yamuna, I think. So there are also very important examples of how these ecosystems can actually be recognized by having their own intrinsic rights, as you say.
I'm also interested in this idea of the tribunals, also because so many of them take place at the borders, I think, between arts and activism and legal systems. I mean, I think there is, for example, this film Bamako, taking place in Mali's capital and bringing more or less the IMF and the WTO to court, or there is Milo Rao's Congo Tribunal. And now at the moment, right while we are sitting here, Jonas Stahl is installing his tribunal for climate justice in Amsterdam, as we have been talking before. So it's interesting how the fields merge together. And also, just looking at your biography, Francesco, you've been active more or less more than 30 years in different activist organizations and co-founded some of them. And now it seems that in the past few years, you seem to have shifted your activities towards the field of art, whereas not really doing completely different things. So it seems very similar to what you've been doing before, at least from the distance, but maybe you would oppose this, this description. How would you describe also this relationship and also this shift of the roles you also personally experience at the moment?
Well, I think it has a lot to do with living together with an artist for 22 years. And basically, you know, every day exchanging thoughts and views. Sooner or later you end up there. No, but indeed, I mean, there's been a very interesting process of mutual contamination, as I would say. But also as an environmental and human rights activist, I always felt the need to look for different languages, to look for different codes, and also to figure out a way to go beyond the field of specialization that many times environmental movements risk of falling a trap in. And the idea of, as Ursula Le Guin was saying, releasing utopian imagination, I think it's a very important one, also for activists. And I think also this exhibition is a very good example of it.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, because when I was in Quito directing the Center of Contemporary Arts, we were hosting one part of the Tribunal of the Mother Earth there, and we were hosting and receiving also a big march that was going to go to Peru to this big event of the COP, the Conference of the Parties on Climate Change. And that was a museum, and that's a contemporary arts center, and we were hosting all these things. But you don't have to look away. We're sitting in an arts institution. We are in this beautiful exhibition happening in a contemporary arts center. We have the other side of the same coin, as I call it, the exhibition by Miguel Lopez, right on the other side of the yard, and it's taking care of also extractivism and all these sorts of thematics. So I think it's the right time. I think that arts and activism, arts and politics, and these subjects sooner or later had to match together. That is the right time. This is exactly what's happening, because it's not enough to talk to people who are already convinced. At a certain point, I was sick to talk with migrant organizations about the problems of migrants. Yeah, we know them, and we're, we say it in Spanish, it's like raining over, on water. Llover sobre mojado, raining on water, where you're not changing anything. But when you start with arts, or in the field of arts, or in the institutions of arts, to, go in a transversal, how do you say, I don't even know enter in this kind of other institutions or other spaces, then you start changing minds. Then you start asking another kind of questions. Then you start coming up with some other questions and thinking about answers. So I think it's just the way things are supposed to be happening, I guess. And this is a beautiful example of that. And you are a beautiful example of that. I mean, you are the, when I talk to you, I know that you know a lot of what's happening on the subject that you're talking. And that's one of, the pleasant things about being able to be here within the exhibition in this space. So.
The fun story about Lima and the COP is that while Rosa was opening up the doors to the convoy of the US Unidos that was then stopped by the police, I was bringing indigenous peoples in the Mali, in the Museum of Arts of Lima, where we organized a hearing of indigenous peoples from the Amazon right into the museum. Where she was opening up the museum, I was invading the museum with indigenous peoples, and that was very, very interesting in a way. So we were basically working from a distance, from different perspectives, but right in the same purpose.
Sorry to spoil the party, but...
Yeah, go. Spoil it.
When is it actually going to result in change? Because there are a lot of protest movements all over the world. I know them from Asia, Europe, of course, United States, Canada, Australia. But I don't see it really reflected in government policy on transportation, on water use, on energy. It's all the old game again, and as soon as we recover from COVID, it will be back to everybody running after their few dollars. And look at Austria. It has Greens in the government. It has a Green president. Where can you say that they haven't made any radical change in the policy? Cars are still holding. Refugees are still treated like shit. Yeah? And generally, there is a lot of lip service to the ecology by all parties, but there is no policy changes, which I see which will have an effect. And time is running out. We saw the IPCC report recently. We saw a new report that came out yesterday that we have about 5 years' time to change maximum, to change our direction. But I don't see it happening. I'm sorry, too pessimistic.
Thanks. I cannot talk from Austria because I'm not Austrian. I cannot talk about any other, but I can talk about Latin America. And even if we were discussing today with Oliver that it's the most dangerous continent for environmental rights defenders. It's a very dangerous region. But I cannot ignore the huge steps that we have accomplished. Because when I was a kid and I was born in Ecuador, indigenous peoples were treated like dogs. You would not talk to an indigenous people and you would not let them go into schools or universities. And one of the most important movements in Ecuador regarding the protection of the Amazon is the Mujeres Amazónicas. And they have been able to stop mining, stop oil drilling, respect their own culture, bring back just last week a procedure was won by the Waorani community, and they were bringing back their own language to their own schools. So there's like small things that happen, and they actually happen. We were last week attending this thing. The Zapatistas are a group that was born in 1984 in Chiapas, 94 in Chiapas, and they have been autonomous for now 30 years, 20 years, I don't know anymore, yeah. And so we went there because what I love about this visit of theirs is that it's not us anymore going to see the Zapatista people and telling them how to do things.
Todo esto llevó mucho tiempo y mucho esfuerzo, porque estábamos cercados, como decía la compañera, por el ejército, pero también nosotros estábamos haciendo ese trabajo de construcción de la autonomía, la explicación y todo lo que teníamos que hacer para resistirnos a no enfrentarnos al ejército. Aunque ellos nos estaban persiguiendo, querían agarrar a nuestros compañeros mandos, nosotros buscábamos la manera de no enfrentarnos. ¿Alguna duda? Pues ya quedaría el espacio para que lo dijera. De nuestra parte es todo. Muchas gracias.
Why do I want to show this to you? Because someone at a certain point declared Mexico a failed state. They are in the middle of a war. They have all the drug lords in there. They have a lot of women in Tijuana dying and being trafficked and everything. But then you have the autonomous region of Chiapas, where these people decided to build their own government and to resist. And that's one of the few places where you don't have the warlords and you don't have the drug lords and everything else. So if you also start looking at things at the planet, at the resistance movement and at the small victories, not like the big states want us to see them, like the geopolitical, but small efforts, then you start seeing that things change, and things have changed. We have the president of our assembly, of our parliament, is a woman from the Amazon right now in Ecuador. So I do see things change. Maybe it's an optimistic way of seeing, but when you're a right holder and you're not just a stakeholder, I think that's the only way to be optimistic, to keep the fight, to keep going, to walk 3 weeks if you need to from the Amazon to the presidential court and the presidential house and protest and ask to defend your own territory and your own environment. And that's the only way I see it.
Yeah, and if I may add, that red line that was launched in Paris has been crossing territories all over the world. I mean, there are very interesting figures, like the Environmental Justice Atlas has been documenting more than 160 cases of mobilization in 46 countries against gas extraction and fossil fuel extraction. So it's called Blockadia, no? And Naomi Klein calls it Blockadia. So when you talk about other, dissident geography or counter mapping, it's also interesting to counter map all these aspects. If you look at the Environmental Justice Atlas, and I was discussing that with Oliver some time ago, we look at them as conflicts, but in fact they are areas of resistance. There are thousands of them worldwide. But the other interesting thing, you're talking about climate change, and you're right. I mean, the figures tell us that, if you recognize the land rights of indigenous peoples and you let them manage the forests and the biodiversity in their territories, that would probably result in a major drop of the carbon emissions, or carbon emissions that will be saved. I was looking at a very recent report by Oil Change, an indigenous environmental network, and they've been analyzing the impact of indigenous people's resistance in 20 selected fossil fuel projects in Canada and United States in the last 10 years, basically say that they managed by blockading those, like in the non-DAPL, like blockading those projects, they basically prevented or delayed gas pollution equivalent to 25% of the US and Canadian emissions. So, you know, the resistance is not only an act, a kind of aesthetic act, but it actually gets into very concrete figures in terms of emission reduction. And also if you look at the degree by which, you know, the disinvestment for fossil fuels have been picking up, I think there are very interesting cases to look at, especially in terms of climate change.
Yeah, I think we should wrap it up with this very optimistic note. And yeah, so I thank you all for participating. And I would also like to announce the coming event, which will be by Amanda Marsha Caminals. She's working in a climate change network in Matadero in Madrid, and I will give a talk on October 14 here. The title of her talk is New Narratives for a Non-Dystopic Ecological Transition.
Excellent. Great, wow.
Very good.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.